While the world was still glued to Donald Trump's latest tariff threats and watching him flirt with the idea of buying Greenland, something far more serious happened between India and EU. India and the European Union signed what they're calling the mother of all deals. And I need you to understand this clearly. This wasn't a routine trade agreement. This was a structural shift in the global order. Now let me say the part most analysts are too polite or too uncomfortable to say out loud. This deal didn't happen because India needed Europe. It happened because Europe ran out of safe options. America became unreliable. China became dangerous. And when you eliminate those two, there is only one economy left on Earth that can absorb scale without political whiplash, sudden sanctions, or tariff tantrums. That economy is India. I watch geopolitics closely. I study how power shifts. And when you work in finance, when you track money flows and policy decisions, you develop a sense for moments that matter. This is one of those moments. Because what I saw on January 27th wasn't just a trade deal being signed, it was the culmination of something much deeper. A quiet, patient strategy that caught the West completely off guard. You see, for months now, India has been under immense pressure. Trump slapped 50% tariffs on Indian goods, then added another 25% on automobiles, then threw on another 25% as punishment for buying Russian oil. That's over 100% combined tariffs on some Indian exports. The message was clear: bend the knee or we'll close our market. And let me be honest with you, a lot of countries would have panicked. A lot of governments would have scrambled to appease Washington, offer concessions, beg for mercy. India did something different. India stayed calm, kept its options open, and quietly accelerated negotiations with Europe that had been stuck for nearly 2 decades. Let's talk about what India was actually facing, because the pressure wasn't just economic, it was designed to be humiliating. The United States wasn't just imposing tariffs. It was sending a message to every country watching. This is what happens when you don't comply. India's trade surplus with the US in 2024? $45.8 billion. Compare that to India's trade surplus with the EU, $25.8 billion. So on paper, India had far more to lose with America than with Europe. That's a lot of economic exposure. That's a lot of jobs, a lot of export revenue, a lot of pressure. At the same time, American officials were demanding India open up its dairy sector, its agriculture, its protected industries, sectors where millions of Indian farmers depend on government support to survive. Now think about this from India's perspective. You're being told to dismantle protections for your farmers while simultaneously being hit with punishing tariffs on your exports. You're being told to play by rules that your negotiating partner changes on social media without warning. And here's the thing that bothers me most about how the West handled this. They assumed India had no choice. They assumed that economic pressure would force India to capitulate, that eventually India would come crawling back, accept whatever terms Washington offered, and be grateful for the privilege. They fundamentally misread India's position, because while Trump was busy threatening allies, changing deal terms 4 months after signing them, and turning trade policy into a reality TV show, India was doing something much smarter. India was building alternatives, and they were doing it quietly. No dramatic announcements, no chest thumping, no nationalistic speeches about sovereignty, just patient, methodical diplomacy. The India-EU Free Trade Agreement didn't start in 2026. It started in 2007. Think about that. 19 years of negotiations, 19 years of disagreements, stalled talks, political roadblocks. The negotiations collapsed completely in 2013. For nearly a decade, this deal was dead. Nobody thought it would ever happen. Then in 2022, talks restarted. And even then, progress was glacial. Because for most of those 19 years, India held firm on positions that Europe found unacceptable. India refused to fully open its automobile sector, refused to compromise on agriculture and dairy, refused to accept conditions it hadn't even agreed to under the WTO framework. Europe wanted access to India's 1.4 billion consumers. They wanted to sell luxury cars without 110% tariffs. They wanted their wines, their spirits, their dairy products flowing into Indian markets. India said, not at the cost of our farmers, not at the cost of our domestic industries, not on terms that treat us as a subordinate partner. And so the talks stalled, year after year after year. So what changed in 2026? Because 20 years ago, supply chains were just economics. Now they're politics. One election can rewrite tariffs overnight. One tantrum can freeze an entire trade corridor. That's why this took 19 years and why it suddenly moved fast. Here's what actually got signed on January 27th. And I want you to really understand the scale of this, because the numbers are staggering. The India-EU trade agreement creates a unified market of 2 billion people. That's India's 1.45 billion plus the EU's 450 million. It represents 25% of global GDP, one-third of global trade. Let me repeat that, because the scale matters. One-third of global trade just organized itself into a framework that doesn't require American participation or dollar intermediation. This is the world's second largest economy, by some measures, and the fourth largest economy coming together. The European Commission is estimating this deal could potentially unlock $75 billion in Indian exports. That's not a small number. That's transformative. The specifics are remarkable. Over 99% of Indian goods will now enter the EU with reduced or zero tariffs. That's 9,425 product lines where tariffs are being slashed or eliminated entirely. Indian textiles, leather, fish, jewelry, sectors worth $33 billion in exports, will see the 10% tariff eliminated immediately as soon as the FTA is implemented. Think about what that means for Indian textile workers, for leather craftsmen, for jewelry makers. These are industries that employ millions of people, industries that were just hit with 50% tariffs in America. India didn't beg America to lower those tariffs. India built an alternative market. For Europe, the gains are equally significant. Automobile tariffs dropped from 110% to 40% initially, then down to 10% over time. That's massive for brands like BMW, Mercedes, Volkswagen. The EU is estimating this could save European exporters up to 4 billion euros annually in duties. For specific sectors, the changes are dramatic. Auto parts tariffs will be completely eliminated after 5 to 10 years. Machinery, chemicals, and pharmaceuticals see tariffs mostly eliminated. Aircraft and spacecraft tariffs disappear for almost all products. European wines and spirits get significantly reduced tariffs, similar to the concessions India gave to the UK in their recent trade deal. But here's where India showed strategic brilliance. And this is what everyone needs to pay attention to. India didn't just roll over and give Europe everything they wanted. They only agreed to tariff cuts on cars priced above $17,000, about 17 lakh rupees. Cars below that price point, still protected. They capped luxury car imports at 200,000 vehicles per year. Only a fixed number of vehicles will qualify for the reduced tariff rate. They kept electric vehicles out of the deal entirely for 5 years, protecting India's growing EV industry during its crucial development phase. And agriculture, dairy, poultry, grains, milk, completely excluded from the agreement. And pharma is where the EU pushed hardest behind closed doors. They wanted data exclusivity, the kind of rule that quietly kneecaps generics. India refused. Because India isn't just exporting pills. India is the pharmacy of the world, and it's not negotiating that identity away. This is Narendra Modi's biggest success, and it deserves emphasis. American officials wanted access to India's dairy sector. European countries wanted the same thing. These are sectors where powerful agricultural lobbies in the West have been demanding market access for decades. Modi said no to America. Modi said no to Europe. He kept Indian farmers' interests paramount, and he made this deal without compromising them. Neither side compromised on what they couldn't afford to lose. Let's get concrete about what this means for ordinary Indians. Because this isn't just about tariffs and GDP percentages. It's about jobs. It's about opportunities. It's about families. First, market access for goods. Indian textiles now have duty-free entry into the world's largest trading bloc. From Punjab to Gujarat, from Maharashtra to Tamil Nadu, textile workers just gained access to 450 million consumers. That's an industry worth billions, employing millions. Indian leather goods, from Karnataka to West Bengal, now enter Europe without the 10% tariff barrier. Indian jewelry, Indian fish products, Indian agricultural exports that were included, all of this now flows into European markets with minimal friction. Second, services and mobility. And this is huge. Indian IT professionals, educators, service providers, they now get access to 144 service sectors across 27 EU countries. Indian companies and professionals get the opportunity to work in these sectors. Entry becomes easier in 102 of these service sectors. Think about what that means for Indian software engineers in Bangalore, consultants in Mumbai, healthcare workers in Delhi. It will become easier for Indian professionals to go to the EU for work and business. Digital payments, online services, everything gets a boost. India is exporting not just goods, but talent. Not just products, but expertise. Third, and this is the part people are missing, leverage. By securing this deal with Europe, India dramatically reduces its dependence on American market access. And here's the quiet win nobody is talking about. MSMES, Europe's compliance maze, carbon paperwork, testing requirements, endless documentation, is what usually kills small exporters. This deal simplifies enough of that process that, for the first time, Europe becomes a real market not just for India's giants, but for India's smaller manufacturers too. That's not a headline. That's a structural change. Now India can say to America, we have options. Now India can negotiate separate deals with different partners based on mutual interest, not subordination. And when you have options, you negotiate from strength. Trump thought he could twist India's arm with tariffs and get work done. He learned that this is new India. No work gets done by twisting Modi's arm. Even big countries are understanding this now. Now let's talk about why this deal made Washington so uncomfortable. Because if you're paying attention to American reactions, you'll notice something interesting. They're not just annoyed about losing market share. They're furious about the timing. The same day, the exact same day that India and the EU announced this historic agreement, Trump threatened to raise tariffs on South Korea from 15% to 25%. Why? Because South Korea's legislature hadn't ratified a trade deal fast enough for his liking. Trump wrote on Truth Social, because the Korean legislature hasn't enacted our historic trade agreement, which is their prerogative, I am hereby increasing South Korean tariffs on autos, lumber, pharma, and all other reciprocal tariffs from 15% to 25%. Notice the phrase, which is their prerogative. Trump acknowledges South Korea has the right to follow its own democratic legislative process, then punishes them for it. Read that again. Trump signed a deal with South Korea in July 2025. By October, he called it pretty much finalized. 4 months later, he's threatening to tear it up because South Korea is following its constitutional requirements for ratification. You see the contrast? Europe and India spent 19 years negotiating patiently, building trust, finding compromise. America signs deals and threatens to break them within months. American media and commentators were furious. Some called the India-EU deal funding a war against yourself, referring to the Ukraine conflict. Their logic? If the EU sticks with India, India's economy grows. India buys oil from Russia. Therefore, Europe is funding Russia by partnering with India. That's the level of thinking coming out of American commentary right now. Meanwhile, American officials are running around saying that Trump should take Greenland, should redraw global borders, should tell other countries how to run their wars. And this is what American strategists are now realizing, or should be realizing. Every time Trump imposes a tariff, every time he breaks a commitment, every time he changes terms via social media, he's giving other countries the political justification to build alternatives. He's not just isolating America economically, he's making American partnership intolerable. And when partnership becomes intolerable, partners find alternatives. That process is now irreversible. EU Trade Chief Maros Shevchovich explicitly stated the India deal would help us have an insurance against the global trade turmoil. That's diplomatic language for insurance against American policy volatility. The same day Trump was threatening South Korea, Ursula von der Leyen was in Delhi shaking hands with Narendra Modi, smiling saying, "We did it. We delivered the mother of all deals. Look at those images. Modi standing between EU leaders, hands raised together. That wasn't just a photo op. That was a message. We are together. We are equals. We don't need permission. Now, I'm not here to tell you this deal is perfect. And I think it's important we ask hard questions because blind celebration helps nobody. There are legitimate concerns we need to address. First, what happens to India's own consumer goods industries? European wines, spirits, chocolates, consumer goods. They're getting tariff reductions. Some will enter India duty-free. Does that hurt Indian producers? Think about it. India adds 40% GST on sin products domestically. That's alcohol, tobacco, and luxury goods. But now European wine enters with zero tariff. Does that make sense? Are we incentivizing European products over Indian ones? These are fair questions. Second, automobiles in the domestic auto industry. Yes, the tariff cuts are limited to expensive cars. Yes, there are caps on imports. Yes, EVs are protected for 5 years. But India has its own auto industry that wants to compete globally. Tata Motors, Mahindra, Maruti Suzuki. These companies have ambitions to become world-class manufacturers. Will cheaper BMWs and Mercedes hurt them? Will it slow their development? Or will competition force them to improve faster? We need to watch this carefully over the next 5 years. Third, and this concerns me most, digital trade. Multiple sources report that the deal includes a digital trade chapter that integrates the majority of rules agreed under the WTO Electronic Commerce Joint Initiative. Here's the problem. India is not a member of that initiative. India deliberately chose not to join because of concerns about data sovereignty, tech regulation, and protecting its growing digital economy. So why is India now agreeing to those rules in a bilateral deal with the EU? What exactly did India commit to in the digital chapter? What does it mean for data localization requirements? For India's ability to regulate big tech? For digital taxation? I don't have those answers yet. Neither does anyone outside the negotiating teams. We need to see the fine print. We need analysts to go through the actual text and explain what India agreed to. Because if India diluted its own protectionist stance by agreeing to conditions it didn't even accept under the WTO regime, that's significant. That's something we need to understand and debate. Fourth, what about the FMCG sector? India's fast-moving consumer goods sector already faces stiff domestic competition. Now, European oils, biscuits, breads, packaged foods will enter with reduced tariffs. Does that hurt Indian brands? Does it create unfair competition? These aren't rhetorical questions. These are real concerns that affect real businesses and real jobs. I'm raising these points not to be negative, but because honest analysis requires acknowledging trade-offs. Every deal involves compromise. Every agreement has winners and losers. The question is, are the gains worth the risks? My assessment, based on what we know so far, is yes. But we need transparency on the digital trade chapter. But here's what I know for certain. What happened on January 27th is not an isolated event. It's part of a broader pattern that should terrify American policymakers. Because look at the timeline. On January 2025, Trump took office, he started tariff wars around February and March 2025. India-EU deal signed in January 2026. That's 12 months from policy chaos to concrete alternative. 12 months. Normally, major powers take years to realign trade relationships. Decades even. This happened in 1 year. That tells you something about how urgent the need for alternatives has become. And it's not just India and Europe. BRICS expanded in 2024 and 2025. Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE joined. The African Continental Free Trade Area is being implemented, creating a market of 1.3 billion people. Regional payment systems are launching that bypass the dollar, from M-Bridge in Asia to bilateral currency arrangements across the global south. Every single one of these developments reduces U.S. leverage in future negotiations. Every single one reduces dependence on dollar-denominated trade. And here's the mechanism that matters. Countries hold reserves in currencies they need for trade. If trade doesn't require dollars, reserve composition shifts. India's calculation now. Why hold massive dollar reserves if the primary growth market is the EU, settled in euros and rupees? The feedback loop accelerates from there. Here's my prediction, and I want to be very clear about this. Within 6 months, we'll see at least two more major trade deals announced explicitly as insurance against American volatility. India will finalize similar frameworks with ASEAN countries. Those negotiations are already underway. The EU will complete deals with Mercosur nations, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, despite French domestic resistance, because the urgency of diversification now overrides internal politics. And by the end of 2026, we'll see measurable decline in the dollar's share of global trade settlement. Not dramatic. The dollar still dominates. I'm not predicting collapse, but the trend line will be established. And that trend line compounds over years into structural change. Every Trump tariff threat will be answered with a new non-US trade agreement within 90 days. South Korea will accelerate regional trade frameworks regardless of whether they ratify the US deal, because they've now learned that ratification doesn't guarantee stability anyway. The US is creating the incentive structure for its own isolation, and American strategists know this. They're watching it happen in real time. The world is building trade architecture explicitly designed to bypass American chaos. Let me tell you what bothers me about the Western response to all this. It's not that they're upset about losing market share. It's that they seem genuinely surprised. Like they couldn't imagine a world where India had agency, where India made strategic choices based on its own interests rather than waiting for Western approval. There's this assumption embedded in how Washington and Brussels have historically dealt with India, that India is a developing country that should be grateful for access to Western markets, that India should accept whatever terms are offered because it needs the West more than the West needs India, that India's role in the global economy is to provide cheap labor, cheap goods, and a large consumer market for Western products. That assumption is now dead. And what killed it wasn't Indian aggression or nationalism. It wasn't loud speeches or military posturing. It was patience. India waited 19 years for this deal. It refused to compromise on core interests. It said no when it needed to say no. It used Trump's chaos as leverage rather than panicking about losing American market access. And when Europe finally came to the table as an equal partner, India was ready. What changed wasn't India's position. What changed was Europe's willingness to treat India as an equal. You know what I find most striking about this whole story? It's not the numbers. It's not the tariff rates or the GDP percentages. It's the quiet confidence. Because think about how India could have responded to Trump's pressure. They could have gone loud, nationalistic, defiant speeches about sovereignty and independence. Modi could have held rallies attacking America. Indian media could have gone full anti-American. They could have made this about ego, about showing strength, about making Trump look weak. They didn't do any of that. They just kept working, kept negotiating, kept building alternatives, kept their farmers protected while opening markets where it made sense. And then, when the deal was ready, they announced it calmly. Modi didn't gloat. He didn't attack America. He didn't make inflammatory statements. He just said, "This agreement has brought very big opportunities for India's 1.4 billion people and millions of people in European countries. This has become a wonderful example of coordination between two big economies of the world." No drama, no theatrics, just, we did it. That's the kind of strength that actually matters in geopolitics. Let me paint you a picture of what this means on the ground. This is the kind of deal that makes India's export targets realistic, not aspirational. If India wants to hit the next export milestone by 2030, you don't do it with speeches. You do it by locking in zero-duty demand in markets that can absorb scale. From Punjab to Rajasthan, Gujarat to Maharashtra, Karnataka to Kerala, Uttar Pradesh to Assam, West Bengal to Telangana, Andhra Pradesh to Tamil Nadu, there's not a single state whose industries won't benefit from this. Punjab's textile industry, direct access to European markets, duty-free. Maharashtra's pharmaceutical sector, reduced barriers, increased exports. Karnataka's IT services, easier mobility for professionals, more contracts. Tamil Nadu's leather industry, tariffs eliminated, markets open. Gujarat's jewelry sector, Export potential unlocked. Kerala's fish products, European markets accessible. This isn't abstract economic policy. This is jobs. This is income. This is growth that people can feel. And the timing couldn't be better because the Indian government is preparing its budget. They're thinking about how to put more money in the common man's pocket. Export growth means more jobs. More jobs mean more income. More income means more domestic consumption. And it's happening at a time when India's economy is already growing like a rocket. So what do you think? Is this deal with Europe actually good for India in the long run? Or do you think the costs will show up later?